There's a specific kind of control that never leaves a mark. No yelling, no threats, no obvious signs. Just a quiet presence that somehow decides things before you even realize a decision was being made. I didn't understand that until the day I got a promotion I'd worked 4 years for, and my first instinct wasn't pride. It was fear. Fear of telling my own mother. That moment cracked something open in me. And I've been sitting with what I found ever since. My mother is a gentle woman. That's genuinely the first word people use when they describe her. Soft voice. Careful posture. Always the first to offer tea, always the last to raise a complaint. People loved being around her. I loved being around her. I grew up in a small house in Ohio with her and my younger sister. My father traveled for work, long stretches, weeks at a time, so for most of my childhood, it was the three of us. And my mother ran everything. Not loudly. Not in a way you'd notice if you weren't paying attention. But she ran it. What I remember most from being a kid isn't rules. We didn't have a lot of explicit rules. What I remember is a particular kind of silence. The kind that told you more than words ever could. If I said I wanted to join the swim team, there was a pause before she responded. A small breath. And then, very carefully, "You could do that. Is that really what you want, though?" And somehow, by the end of the conversation, I had decided it wasn't. I didn't join the swim team. I didn't join a lot of things. I remember thinking, back then, that she just knew me better than I knew myself. That felt like a gift. I told myself that for a long time. I moved to Chicago when I was 24. New city, first real job, the whole thing. I was excited and terrified in equal measure. My mother helped me pack. She drove with me to the new apartment, organized my kitchen, made sure I had enough food for 2 weeks. She was wonderful. She called every day. Sometimes twice. That felt normal at first. I was her daughter, alone in a new city. Of course she'd check in. But then things started to happen. Small things. I'd mention someone I met at work, a friend, maybe someone I was considering dating. And she'd ask questions. Thoughtful questions, concerned questions. "Do you really know enough about him yet?" Or, "She sounds nice, but does she seem reliable?" The questions weren't mean. They were careful. They came from what felt like love. And slowly, quietly, the people I was considering letting in. I let fewer and fewer of them in. I told myself I was just being discerning. That I had high standards. I remember the exact phrase I used in my own head, "I'm just careful with my energy." That felt like wisdom. Like something I'd figured out. It took me a long time to notice that every time I exercised that so-called caution, I called my mother first. The promotion happened in my 4th year at the company. I was named regional director, a role I'd actively pursued, built a case for, negotiated for. It was mine. I'd earned it completely. I sat in my car after the meeting, and the first thing I felt was relief. And then immediately, without thinking, I started rehearsing the phone call. Not to share good news. To manage the reaction. I'd been unconsciously doing the math for years. Would she think this was too much too fast? Would she worry about the added stress? Would she ask if I was sure this was the right move, if I'd really thought it through? I sat in that parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I called her. Her reaction was warm. She said she was proud. But then, almost immediately, she started asking questions. Had I considered what it would mean for my schedule? Did I know what the expectations would look like in the first year? Was I sure the company was stable enough for this to be a long-term thing? I answered everything calmly. I said yes to each one. And when I hung up, I noticed something strange. I felt slightly less certain than I had an hour ago. The promotion itself hadn't changed. Nothing had changed. But something had shifted. That's when I finally started to see it clearly. I started paying attention after that. Really paying attention. I started noticing the pattern not just in big moments but in ordinary ones. I'd mention I was thinking about repainting my living room. She'd say, "Oh, that could be nice," and then ask if I was sure about the color, if I'd looked at enough options, if I'd thought about resale value. By the end of the week, I'd talked myself out of it. I'd mention I was considering a weekend trip. She'd ask if I'd be okay traveling alone, whether I'd researched the area, whether I'd looked at reviews. 2 weeks later, I still hadn't booked anything. She never told me not to do any of these things. She never said no. She just asked questions. Careful, thoughtful, loving questions. And I had trained myself, over 30 years, to interpret those questions as a reason to pause. And pausing, in my life, had almost always meant stopping. What scared me wasn't the realization that she'd done this. What scared me was how much I had participated in it. How eagerly. How gratefully. I had always thought of my mother's gentle consistency as a kind of safety net. What I was only now beginning to understand was that a safety net, depending on how it's used, can be something you fall into on purpose, to avoid ever having to land on your own. I didn't confront her. I want to be clear about that. This isn't that kind of story. What I did was something harder and more confusing. I tried to understand her. I talked to my aunt, my mother's older sister, for the first time as an adult. Really talked. And what I learned was that my mother had grown up in a house where things went wrong when decisions were made impulsively. Her father made bold choices that fell apart. They moved 4 times before she was 12. Nothing felt stable. Nothing felt safe. And so she had built, very carefully, a life defined by caution. By asking one more question before acting. By making sure. She had passed that down to me not out of control, but out of love. Out of the deep, genuine belief that the careful way was the safe way. That asking more questions protected the people she loved. She wasn't manipulating me. She was mothering me the only way she knew how, through the psychology that had kept her safe her whole life. That understanding didn't make the pattern disappear. But it changed what I did with it. I painted the living room a deep, warm green. I didn't ask anyone first. I booked the weekend trip. I went alone. It was fine. More than fine, actually. There were a few hours on the second day that were genuinely some of the best I can remember, just wandering without a plan. I told my mother about both things after the fact. She said the color sounded lovely. She said she was glad the trip went well. What I noticed, and I think about this a lot, is that nothing bad happened. Not because of luck. Because most of the fears those questions had been feeding weren't real dangers. They were inherited patterns. Stories about risk that had been told to me so quietly, so gently, over so many years, that I had come to believe they were my own thoughts. Here's what I keep coming back to: the most powerful influence in your life might never once raise its voice. It might come wrapped in love. It might ask questions instead of giving orders. It might look, from the outside, like concern. And from the inside too, for a long time. The hardest thing I've ever tried to do isn't something dramatic. It's learning to sit with a decision long enough to figure out whether the hesitation I feel is actually mine, or whether I borrowed it from someone else a long time ago and just never gave it back. I don't think my mother did anything wrong. I really don't. But I also can't unknow what I know now. And so I'm learning, slowly, to tell the difference between caution that protects me and caution that just keeps me still. I'm still figuring out which is which. But at least now, I know to ask.